Welcome back to Outside Views. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe for in-depth analysis on Brexit and UK politics. And let's get into today's topic. Brexit was supposed to simplify things for Britain. Instead, it has created one of the most complex, confusing and bureaucratic travel systems in modern Europe. Traveling to the EU is no longer the seamless experience it once was. Instead, British travelers now face a maze of red tape, restrictions, and sometimes outright contradictions in the rules they must follow. And let's break it down. And first, let's talk about the infamous 90-180 rule. British citizens can no longer stay in the EU indefinitely. Instead, they are now third country nationals subject to the same restrictions as people from Venezuela or Tonga. And that means you can only stay in the EU or the Schengen zone for 90 days within any rolling 180-day period. And this has caused chaos for many frequent travelers, especially second homeowners and retirees who used to spend long periods in places like Spain or France. Some travelers have already been caught out, not realizing that a previous short stay counted against their 90-day allowance. If you overstay, you could be fined, but also deported or even banned from entering the Schengen zone in the future. And it's a far cry from the days of free movement. But there is more. British passports are now subject to stricter rules when entering the EU. Many travelers are still being turned away at airports because their passports don't meet the new conditions, new to them, not in general. The passport must be no older than 10 years on the day you arrive in the EU, and it must have at least 3 months of validity left on the day you leave. And many British travelers have been wrongly turned away by airlines due to misunderstandings of these rules, missing holidays, family events, and even weddings. The confusion stems from some airlines incorrectly assuming that UK passports expire after 9 years and 9 months. This is incorrect, but the misinformation continues to circulate, and passengers are paying the price. And now let's talk about the new EU travel authorizations. Soon, British travelers will have to apply for the European Travel Information and Authorization System, or ETIAS. And this is the EU's equivalent of the US ESTA system, or the ETA now in Britain. It will cost €7 and require an online application before travel. However, ETIAS cannot start until the EU Entry-Exit System, or EES, is fully operational. The EES was originally supposed to launch in 2024, but has been delayed multiple times. It is now expected to be fully implemented by late 2026 at the earliest. Once in place, EES will require biometric checks on all non-EU travelers entering the Schengen zone. And that means fingerprints and facial scans at the border, similar to systems already in place in the US. It will add yet another layer of bureaucracy for British travelers who once moved freely between the UK and the EU. If I go to Belgium, I don't need that, for example. But what about dual nationals? Many British citizens also hold EU passports, particularly from Ireland, and this allows them to bypass many of these restrictions. But there are still logistical issues. Airlines require passport information in advance, and most systems can only store one passport per traveler. And that means dual nationals must decide whether to book their flight with their UK passport or their EU passport. The best approach is to use the EU passport when booking and going through EU immigration, then use the UK passport when re-entering the UK. This avoids unnecessary questions and ensures you don't run into any problems with overstaying limits. And then there are the smaller but equally frustrating contradictions in Brexit travel rules. For example, some British travellers with EU spouses believe they could freely accompany their partners under EU freedom of movement rules. But in practice, border officials in some countries have been inconsistent in enforcing these rights. There have been reports of UK nationals with EU spouses being wrongly told they needed a visa to stay in the Schengen zone beyond 90 days. Even within the UK itself, Brexit has created extra layers of complexity. You know, the UK has introduced its own version of ETIAS, the Electronic Travel Authorization, or ETA. And this means EU nationals, including Irish residents who do not hold an Irish passport, will soon have to apply online or pay a fee before visiting the UK. And this has already sparked tensions with Northern Ireland, where free movement across the Irish border was supposed to be protected by the Good Friday Agreement. And finally, let's talk about what happens when things go wrong. More and more British travellers are finding themselves stranded or denied boarding because of Brexit travel rules. And one of the most common issues is British citizens being denied boarding because their passport is too old, even when it meets EU entry requirements. And this is due to airline staff misinterpreting the rules, and passengers have little recourse other than to rebook and hope for better luck next time. But there's still sometimes the passports too old if they have been extended. And some have had holiday plans ruined because of last-minute refusals. And others have been stuck in bureaucratic nightmares trying to prove they are allowed to travel. And this is not just about holidays. Business travelers, musicians, and sports people have all faced difficulties because of the new travel restrictions. Before Brexit, British professionals could work freely across the EU without worrying about visa requirements or travel permits. Now they must navigate a complex web of regulations with different countries imposing different restrictions on who can work and for how long. Talking about sovereignty here. Musicians, for example, now need work permits for multiple EU countries if they want to tour. Many have had to cancel tours because the bureaucracy has made it financially unviable. And even short business trips require careful planning to avoid visa issues. Brexit has not just created travel red tape, it has made it harder for British workers to operate in Europe. And what about the long term? As more restrictions come into place, British travellers will find themselves increasingly treated as outsiders in the rest of Europe. And queues for passport control will even get longer. More documentation will be required for simple trips, and the cost will continue to rise. And this is the opposite of what Brexit was supposed to achieve. Instead of making things simpler, it has created more hassle, more cost, and more uncertainty. And there's little sign that the UK government is working to fix it somehow. So where does that leave us? Brexit was supposed to cut red tape. Instead, it has created an enormous bureaucracy just to go on holiday. And it has made travel more expensive, more complicated, and more uncertain. And British travellers who once moved freely across Europe now find themselves queuing for extra passport checks, filling out online applications soon, and worrying about whether they will be denied entry. The UK government promised that Brexit would give Britain control over its borders at the time. What it failed to mention was that it also meant more restrictions for British citizens travelling abroad, because the EU has control over its borders. So what do you think? Has Brexit made travel too complicated? Are these restrictions justified, or are they just unnecessary bureaucracy? And do you think British travellers will eventually push for an easier system, or is this the new normal? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below the video. Let's discuss, and if you want to see another video, there's one right here in the end screen.